Lord has any sense of humor at all. He's going to get everybody lined up and go, who all sat on the first 3 pews at services? And he's just going to usher them in, and he's just going to let everybody else sit there for about 1,000 years and wonder. Well, it's good. It's good to see all of you this evening. Somebody needs to explain to me sometime what the deal is about sitting in the back. I had a really good friend when I lived in Texarkana, and she legitimately had a phobia, and she just couldn't have anybody behind her, so she sat at the back all the time. Other than her, I don't get it. So, and if it wasn't for, you three, I'd just move on back and be close to you and make you feel really uncomfortable through the whole class. In fact, I may just walk back and stand in front of some of you anyway. So, if you're going to sit in the back, which you're welcome to do, make sure you speak up, okay? We are on lesson number, 14, 13, 14? I've got, lesson 14 is basically where we're Yes, ma'am. It's been a long time since I had a response to a sermon, Are you scared?
Yeah, I ain't missing my free spot.
That was a joke. I actually was in a meeting in Florida. They had a tent meeting last year in May. Okay? Florida in May outside. And got there and we set up chairs. I went and helped set up all the chairs. First night we got there was no one on the first 4 rows. And the rest of the place was packed. And I made some smart aleck comment like I just did. And about a dozen people got up and came and sat on the front row. And I was so uncomfortable preaching that. Let's speak to the Lord before we start. Would you bow with me, please? We're grateful for the opportunities of the evening, Father. We praise and magnify you for you're worthy. We recognize how small we are and how impotent we are. And we are so very thankful that you take note of us, that you care for us, that you provide for us, that you have offered salvation to us. And we pray that as your people, we might live in such a way that will honor you with our lives. We're thankful for Jesus and what he has done and what he continues to do. We're grateful for the Spirit and the work that he has accomplished in Revelation. And we acknowledge our dependence upon you. Help us to live lives of faith. Help us to be diligent. Help us in our study this evening that we will have a better appreciation for you and a better appreciation for the reasons that we should trust you. We ask for forgiveness, for patience with us when we struggle. We ask for strength in our weaknesses, and we especially pray for those who are struggling for whatever reason, that they might be comforted and we might do what we can to help. In Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, we are in the midst of talking about essentially Jacob and Esau. As the last lesson, we really looked predominantly at the blessing that Isaac has offered to Jacob, even though he was intending to offer it to Esau. And when I said we're on lesson 14, I think that I mentioned as we finished, we were at kind of number 10 on lesson 13, which really takes us into the next lesson. So in Genesis, 26, I guess, is that right? Am I in the right? 27. At the end of 27, the question is, how does Rebekah involve Isaac in accomplishing Jacob's departure? You'll remember that Esau becomes enraged at his brother because of his deception of Isaac and stealing, in his mind, of the blessing, and is determined that as soon as his father dies, he's going to kill his brother. I do think that there is some cruel, I wouldn't say cruel, maybe intentional, maybe this says something about the Lord too, twist of fate, if you would, that Isaac's going to go on to live another, maybe 60 years after this. And so Esau's going to have a lot of time to cool off. But because of Esau's anger, Rebekah involves herself in getting Jacob out of Dodge. So the question is, what does she do to facilitate Jacob's departure? Yeah, she takes advantage of the circumstance with Esau and Esau's Canaanite wives. Now we have already been told that these women were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So I don't think she's making something up. But she does take note of that circumstance, and in doing so, after telling Jacob that he needed to leave town because Esau's going to try to kill him, she turns to her husband and basically says, you know, Esau's wives are driving me crazy. I don't know if Isaac knows about Esau's threat upon Jacob's life. I would think that would be reasonable that he would, but we don't know that for sure. But she goes to Isaac, verse 46, I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. I don't know what the problem is with these women. You know, Sister Ellis and I were talking about this before class. We tend to think, I believe, of the patriarchs as really godly people. And it does appear that, for instance, Abraham was a man that lived with great attention to obedience to God. I don't get as much that impression with Isaac. I certainly don't get that impression with Jacob. And Jacob's sons then are just all over the map. They are not really, in the ways we would measure such, they're not necessarily really good people all the time. And that becomes very apparent as the story unfolds. But I think they were probably infinitely better than the Canaanites. And my suspicion is that the moral failings of these Hittite women are what are such a worrisome thing to Isaac and Rebekah, maybe for a couple of reasons. Some of it could just be because of the family ties. You know, we see, for instance, Hagar, when God sends her away, where does she immediately go? Anybody remember? She goes back to Egypt. Don't you know, had she stayed there and had Ishmael been a part of God's promise, that connection would have been troublesome. And I think that's part of it. I think part of it may well be they are concerned about God's promise, and the Canaanites, they know God has determined that the Canaanites are going to be destroyed when their iniquity is full. And so, you know, what's this going to do to the promise? What's this going to do to the family? If these are not godly young women and they are given to immorality, I mean, we're going to see some of that in a couple of lessons with Shechem and Jacob's daughter Dinah. If they're given to immorality, then who knows who the father is when a child is born. And so, you know, as a mom might well be concerned about her family, she is concerned about these boys, so she just tells Isaac, look, I don't want to live if this keeps up. And so send Jacob off. Actually, she doesn't say send Jacob off. What she says is, if Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like the daughters of the land, what good would my life be to me? And I think she plants the seed and Isaac runs with it. Okay? So that's kind of how she accomplishes this. I read an interesting observation about this. Jacob was kind of a homebody who dwelt in tents, who was his mama's boy. It probably wasn't easy to get Jacob to leave, much less to get Isaac to bless him so that he leaves with some incentive to come back home. You know, why would he come back? Well, because he has the birthright and he has the blessing. And you'll notice that Rebekah doesn't intend for him to be gone a long time. In chapter 27 and verse 44, she says, go to Laban, my brother, and stay with him a few days till your brother's fury returns. It's going to be 20 years before he comes back. Maybe longer than that before he actually gets back to the family. And there is some speculation as to whether Rebekah ever saw him again after he leaves. And I think it's at least very possible that she didn't. That's not part of the plan in their mind. There's a lot of irony that takes place at this point. But if Isaac sends him away with the blessing, then he's got something to come back to. Okay? Because when he leaves, if anybody studied ahead, what does he say himself that he left with? Anybody know? He basically tells his brother Esau, I left with nothing but my staff in my hand. and here I am coming back with two companies, is the way that goes. And so here's some incentive to come back home, and that takes us to the next chapter, actually the next several chapters in this lesson, where we learn about Jacob and and Rachel and Leah and this whole menagerie that becomes his family. And so from chapter 28 through chapter 31, where did Isaac demand that Jacob go to find a wife? Okay, back to Haran or Padan Aram, where Naboth's family are. And at this point, Laban is kind of the patriarch of the family. He is the oldest brother. And so Jacob sends him to go there. Notice in verse 2, and take a wife there from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. How do you reckon Isaac knew that Laban had daughters? Nobody? The answer is no idea. God doesn't tell us. It almost sounds like there's been some communication between the families. Okay? Either that or Laban had daughters before Rebekah had left home, which has now been over 60 years. Okay? Well, remember Jacob may well be 75 years or older at this point. In fact, it's really hard to get past that he's got to be. We know he's over 40. And probably a good bit over 40 if you start trying to add together little references here and there. Most people who really delve into that think that he was probably somewhere. The date that I keep running into is he's 77 years old when he leaves. It's hard for me to get my head around that. But as the story goes, it's kind of hard to disprove it as well. So go to Laban and find a wife from one of Laban's daughters. The reasons that contribute to this, as we have just talked about, is mainly because of Rebekah. And then here's the interesting thing. What blessing does Isaac send Jacob away with? Yeah, this is the closest thing that we have seen to a statement of the promise to Abraham. Beginning of verse 2, may God bless you, make you fruitful and multiply you. May you be an assembly of peoples and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants to inherit the land in which you're a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. It's not really Isaac's to convey, and yet at the same time, he has to look at what's happened. Jacob's got the birthright. Jacob's got the blessing. God has made this prediction. It keeps working out this way, and especially if he and Esau were kind of conspiring to change that in the last chapter. At this point, I think he finally just has to say, look, God's going to accomplish this one way or the other. And so he sends him off with this blessing, which again would provide some great incentive to him, I think, to turn around and come back home. I want you to consider another thing. When Abraham sends to Naboth's family to get a wife, what restrictions does Abraham put upon his servant? Do you remember? There are two things he tells him. Okay, don't marry a Canaanite, and don't let him leave the country. Don't take him with you to go to Padan Aram. And yet now Isaac sends Jacob off, okay? And I think that there had to have been, to some extent, some temptation to go up there and stay there. Which may account for the fact that God's going to appear to him here in a chapter, or actually later in this chapter, and offer to him the blessing of Abraham on the condition that he comes back home. And I hadn't really made that connection before, but that seems very likely to me. That Isaac's trying to get him back home. God makes a provision to get him to come back home because there's a very real danger. And it nearly happened anyway. That he's going to get up there and just stay up there. And I think that's what Abraham was concerned about in regards to Isaac. And so Isaac conveys this blessing on him, and he has the birthright, and he has the firstborn's blessing, and now he has the Abrahamic blessing, and he goes off with absolutely nothing. Doesn't that seem wrong? You know, who's the outcast here? Well, Esau's the one who's had everything taken away, and his dad told him, you're not going to live off the land, you're going to live by your sword. And yet the irony is that Jacob, for all of his deception, has secured all of this stuff, and he leaves with nothing but his staff. And he is an outcast, which may address, that God's given him a little taste of what he has sown. And I think that that's interesting, okay? I'm not going to make too much of it at this point, but I do think that that's kind of interesting. We don't know, but what Esau, there's no indication that Esau was sent off. Okay? Now, we know he's going to end up away, but not very far away. I think it's very possible Esau had some connection with his family, where for the next 20 years, Jacob has none. Okay? But just file that away. Dennis? Yeah, but he doesn't really seem to get that until his brother-in-law or his uncle really rakes him over the coals and gets him a taste of his own medicine. It's only after he deals with Laban for 20 years that he really seems to have much appreciation for God's blessing. Andrew?
By going away with nothing and coming back with a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so hang on to that thought, because that's very much part of what's going to take place here when he's traveling and he spends the night in Bethel. Verse 2, or number 2, how did Esau react to Jacob's departure? Yeah, he sees that Mom's not happy with his wife, so he's going to go find a family connection. So he goes and marries Ishmael's daughter. I'm not sure how that went over. I'll tell you the thing that I noticed in this as well is that he has to be aware that Isaac sends Jacob off with another blessing. And don't you know that was rubbing salt in Esau's wounds, especially if there was a scheme to give a blessing to Esau in spite of what God had said. And so by the time Jacob leaves town, Esau's mad. Esau's displeased. He's lost favor with his family. Jacob's got another blessing. He goes off and leaves with the permission of his parents. And so he makes some effort to get back in good graces with his family. And so he goes and takes the daughter of Ishmael. And she is actually mentioned a couple of times as the story unfolds. Okay, what happened at Bethel? And why is this significant? Actually, this is very significant. Do what? Yeah, God appears to Jacob. Okay, he appears to Jacob in a dream. This is a famous dream. What does Jacob see? He sees a ladder, probably a stair. What we think of as a stairway. Okay, the word ladder, stairs, the same thing. And what's happening on these stairs? Angels going up, coming down, and who's at the top? God. God's at the top, and he speaks to Jacob. And I want you to appreciate what he says to Jacob. Beginning in verse 13, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Your descendants also shall be the dust as the dust of the earth. You'll spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. In you and in your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. Behold, I'm with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. Listen, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. There's, again, some interesting almost irony here. He's about the same age that Abraham was when God gave the same promise to Abraham, except Abraham had to leave the land where he was and come to this land. And so God essentially says, you're the one in line. You're the one I'm going to accomplish everything through. But the thing I find interesting is that he says, I'm going to bring you back here. And Jacob's reaction is what? How does he react to this? First thing that he reacts is what? Well, the first thing is, I'm sorry? Yeah, it scares him. Okay, when you look at verse 17, he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place?" The word "awesome" is the same word. It's the what would that be? The adjectival form of the word fear, not respect. Scared. And so, if you were to translate this in a way that it was much clearer, he would say, "How scary is this place? Surely the Lord is Yahweh, is in this place, and I didn't know it. And this is the gate of heaven. This is the one place on earth where you can walk up the stairs and get to heaven." That's the way Jacob sees this, which is interesting. What are concepts about heaven and hell and God? And so you get a little glimpse as to how they thought about all this. He wakes up in the morning, takes the stone that he had at his head, whether it was, some people say, a pillow. I'm more inclined to think that he's laying up against a stone kind of as a protection, as a barrier. And he sets it up as a pillar. He pours an offering on it and names the place Bethel, which means the house of God. And look at verse 20. He made a vow saying, "If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then Yahweh will be my God." What's the implication of that? It wasn't his God at this point. Okay? Do you think of the patriarchs that way? We've made the observation as we've gone along, and I think you really see it in Jacob's life, that these people are learning to trust God. They didn't just wake up one morning and they have this wonderful knowledge of Yahweh so that they put their trust in God. They are being introduced to God. Where Abraham's faith came from is interesting, because his family are idolaters, and we're going to see this when Jacob gets up here to Laban, because Rachel's going to steal the family idols from Laban. And so you've got a family of idolaters. Where did Abraham's faith come from? I don't know. Whatever experience he had with God, he learned to trust Him. Where did Isaac's faith come from? Well, whatever experiences he had with God and the influence of his father. And here's Jacob, and Jacob at this point doesn't even acknowledge Yahweh as his God. You may be daddy's God. You may be granddaddy's God. That doesn't make you my God. And I made a note about this, and I think this is interesting, and it's something that everybody ought to give some consideration to. Even the patriarchs had to learn trust, and trust is not something that's inherited. Tradition is inherited. Ritual is inherited, but trust isn't. My dad was D. Bowman, but that doesn't mean that I was going to trust God. My girls spent their life listening to me preach, but that doesn't mean they're going to trust God. And we make a terrible mistake when we think that our children and our grandchildren are just automatically going to adopt a trust in God because we trusted in God. You never see that in the Scriptures. It's only when the evidence for trust is conveyed, and that's pretty powerful. What, Andrew?
Well, all through the Bible it says, "Your God, if your God can do this for me, I'll believe it."
Yeah. That's right. Just Sunday, I talked about the passage about putting God to the test, about tempting God. That's exactly what Jacob does. And God tolerates it now. Why does God tolerate Jacob to say, "All right, if you'll bring me back and give me food and a place to stay, I'll worship you"? Why does God tolerate that from him? Huh?
He doesn't have another way to learn it.
Okay, well, that's a good observation. Yes, ma'am, Phyllis?
This is a point of transformation in his life, right?
Well, it is. It is. I think that's probably true as well. Think of the big picture. God's made a promise, and what's God doing in the Bible at this point, not only for Jacob, but for the Israelites who are going into the land of Canaan, and for us? What's God doing? He's revealing himself. He's showing us the kind of being that he is. Here's somebody that in some ways apparently either doesn't know better. I mean, he's 75 years old. He's not a teenager. And yet God's patient with him. God's tolerant with him. Here's a man that's having to learn. Here's a man that for whatever reason has not paid much attention to what his mom and dad taught him, if they taught him. Rebekah was a child of Nahor. Her family are idolaters. Think about that when we get to Rachel and Leah. And so God is revealing himself for all of us, not just for Jacob. And so I think his tolerance is because at this point, maybe God is going to have to prove himself, because he hasn't done so yet. By the time you get to Moses in Deuteronomy 6 saying, don't put God to the test, God's already proven himself. And so this is fascinating. It's very fascinating to me that Jacob basically says, all right, I'll make a deal with you. You take care of me and I'll worship you. So we get to number 4, and we get Jacob coming to Padan Aram, chapter 29, and the meeting with Rachel, okay, which is pretty typical. It's the same picture that you saw with Abraham's servant and Rebekah. They're at the well to feed the flocks. It's the same picture. Well, let me ask you, where does this happen again later on? Where somebody meets their wife because they're watering the sheep at the common well. Moses and Zipporah. So it's not an uncommon picture, you know. I mean, I'm not sure I'd go down to the local livestock pen to look for a woman. But, you know, if there's a bunch of shepherd women on their way up there, we can send Devin, okay? Because he's looking all the time. So, but that was a common way that those things were done. And so Jacob comes up to the well. It's a gathering place, and he starts making inquiries. And so makes an inquiry. Do you know Laban the son of Nahor? Oh, yeah, we know Laban the son of Nahor. In fact, here comes his daughter Rachel with her flocks. And Jacob is smitten and sees the hand of God in all this. And I think, well, he should. Clearly, this is providential. And so he goes and, cries and kisses her. Isn't that? Yeah, or kisses her and then cries and goes home. I'm not even going to make that joke. Goes home to meet the family, and you have the deal being struck. Okay, so what's their relation to one another? They're cousins. Okay, and the proposition that Jacob makes, first I want you to notice that he works for him for a while. How long does Jacob work for Laban? Nope, not the first note. A month. If you look at verse 14, Laban said, surely your bone and my flesh. So he stayed with him a month. And then Laban approaches Jacob and says, because you're my relative, tell me what you want. And I don't know if Jacob's just wily enough to think sooner or later he's going to ask what I want. And so he says, all right, I'll tell you what, I'll serve you for 7 years for your younger daughter. And Laban is very general in his response to this. Well, it's better I give her to you than to another man, so stay with me. So 7 years goes by, and briefly, because Jacob is so smitten with Rachel, and again, it's hard for me to see this happening to somebody at 75. 20, yeah. 75, that's just hard. But I'm not doubting the story, and it's got to be that we know he's at least 40. At the end of 7 years, Jacob goes to Laban and says, now notice he says, give me my wife. What does he not say? Give me Rachel. And so Laban says, okay, I'll give you a wife. And, it's dark. Goes in to his wife for the wedding night festivities to make her his wife officially. And when the light comes on, it ain't Rachel. Okay? Next morning, it's not Rachel. And here's some irony for you. I served for 7 years for Rachel. No, verse 25, what have you done to me? Was it not Rachel I served for? Why have you deceived me? Don't you know that Laban could easily say, well, the Lord told me to do that. And payback is rough, ain't it? Because Jacob has deceived people his whole life. He has met his match in Laban. And there's a lot that happens in the next 16 years here, or next 14 years. 17, 14, 20. That's going to be quite fascinating because Jacob really does struggle. I mean, he's going to wrestle with an angel, and that's very emblematic of what he's happening in his life. He is wrestling at this point. So Laban's response is, well, in our country, we can't give the younger the firstborn. At which point I would have said, you could have told me that 7 years ago. But he doesn't. And so Laban says, fulfill her week, and we'll give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. You know, it's easy to kind of think through this stuff and not pay a lot of attention. In my mind, this was always Jacob's offer. Okay, I'll stay another 7 years. Laban knew exactly what he was doing when he sent Leah into that tent to begin with. He's going to get another 7 years of free labor from someone who has been blessed by God, and he recognizes it. So Laban is wily and crafty on his own with his own selfish agenda. And we're going to find out later on that apparently he's not paying him any kind of wages other than he's just providing for him. And so that's where we are. Chapter 29, we then start to see the family feud that develops. How many sons does Jacob have with Leah? And this is where this goes very quickly because this is the pertinent part of the story. How many sons? Okay. How many in this chapter? 4 in this chapter. Okay. And there's a kind of a back and forth as this story goes along. I want you to notice that all 4 of these children, when they are named by Leah relative to the circumstance, to the sibling rivalry that's going on between her and Rachel. Rachel is the loved wife. Leah is clearly she's clearly disregarded by Jacob. And you'll notice that God notes that in verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. And so apparently Jacob just doesn't give her much consideration until he figures out that she can have children and that Rachel can't. And so he is intimate with her enough that he starts a family. But it does not appear that she's the spouse that's cared for because she names Reuben. Look, I've got a son. See, a son, that's Reuben's name. And then Simeon. Simeon's name is attached. The Lord has heard that I'm unloved, so he's given me this son so that Jacob will attach himself to me. Verse 34, she has Levi. Levi's name, Simeon's name means God's heard me. Levi's name means now he's going to become attached to me. And then in verse 35, I'm going to call his name Judah. I'll be praised because I have these children. And yet, it becomes very clear that that's not the way this is all going to go. And so the next chapter really starts to tell us about this sibling rivalry. Let me make this suggestion to you. This goes to Jacob's struggle again. He's wrestling with Esau. He's wrestling with his father. He's wrestling with these 2 sisters who are wrestling with one another over his affection. So when he ends up wrestling with God, I want you to appreciate that there's a lot of foreshadowing of that before we ever get to the angel wrestling with Jacob. And so you have these 4 sons of Leah. The rivalry is not the bearing of children. The rivalry is who their husband loves. Okay? That's the basis of the rival that we see here. And so what happens is that both of them do what? In order to try to keep Jacob in their bed, essentially. Yeah, when Rachel can't have children, and you'll notice she gets mad at Jacob about that. Why don't you give me children? Don't you know Jacob was tempted to go, hey, walk on that other tent over there. I can have children. It's not me. And so she says, okay, well, here's Bilhah. Okay, this follows the pattern. This is what their grandmother had done, when she was barren. And so Jacob says, okay, and has 2 children by Bilhah. And Rachel, again, names them relative to the ongoing contention. God has judged my case, therefore she called his name Dan. Bilhah conceived again in verse 7. With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister. Here's that wrestling thing again. So she called his name Naphtali. And Leah at this point is not having children for whatever reason. And she says 2 can play this game. So she gives Zilpah to Jacob. And Jacob has Gad and Asher. And at this point, you have a little story thrown in about the mandrakes, which I've always found kind of interesting and, to be honest with you, confusing. Mandrakes were seen not so much as an aphrodisiac as a fertility drug. Okay, and so Reuben finds them in the field, and he's got to be a kid, a little kid at this point. So he brings them to his mom. Look at these that I found. And when Rachel finds out about it, she asks for some because Rachel is barren. I can't have any kids. We all know what this can do. And so they strike a bargain. Rachel asks for the mandrakes and says to Leah at the end of verse 15, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. I don't think it's Leah going, no, you can't have any, that Jacob's going to run to my tent because I'm going to bribe him. I think what Rachel is saying is, look, give me some and you can have him for the night. And that's what happens when verse 16, when Jacob comes in from the field, Leah goes out and said, you got to come into me. We've got a deal and you're going to abide by it. So he goes in, and Leah has been praying to God. God listens to her, bears Jacob a 5th son, Issachar, and then a 6th son, Zebulun, and then Dinah, a daughter. Okay? But still, Rachel is the preferred wife. And so you get to verse 22. Finally, God grants Rachel a child. God's taken away my reproach, so she calls him Jacob. And at this point, Jacob comes and asks if he can go back home. So we are at number 8. How many children are fathered by Jacob in this chapter, or at this point? 12. 11 sons and daughter. Benjamin's going to come later on. And then, why does Jacob propose to go back to Canaan? When he comes to Laban and says, let me go home, why? Say it again, Phyllis. Okay, it does say he wants to go back to his own country, but it says something else too. Do what? Okay, to his place. Yeah, notice verse 30. Before I came, what you had was little, he tells Laban, and now it's increased. The Lord's blessed you since my coming, but I need to provide for my own house. I don't have anything. I've got a family, and yet I have nothing. That's part of it. And remember, God told him, you come back, and I'll take care of you. And so all this is kind of wrapped into one. And so Laban basically says, what do you want? And so Jacob starts thinking, here's the conniving once again. I don't want you to pay me anything. I tell you what, I'm going to go through your flocks, and everything that's multicolored is mine. Generally, the sheep would be light white, and the goats would be black. That's the way that the flocks of that day and in that area worked. So it was very uncommon. It'd be recessive. Very uncommon to have 2 black goats or 2 white sheep to produce a spotted or a multicolored animal. So there wouldn't be a lot in the flock, and Laban's looking at that going, he knows enough about breeding to go, well, take them. And so Jacob takes care of Laban's flocks, and his own flocks are sent 3 days away, the multicolored ones, and either Laban's sons or Jacob's sons, hard to tell in verse 36 who's taking care of them, but Jacob is still taking care of Laban's flocks. And so, What does Jacob do to kind of address this situation? This is perhaps the most confusing custom in the Bible. Maybe after why you can't boil a goat in its mother's milk, which I've never gotten. Anybody? Yeah, he peels branches from several different trees. He puts them in the watering trough with the idea that if a sheep or a goat conceives at the watering trough, they're going to produce speckled or multicolored animals. And the tradition, as best I can tell, and I've read this in a bunch of different places, is that they thought whatever an animal was focused upon when it was bred would have an impact upon the offspring. So if they're focused on something multicolored, the stripping of the branches so that they're white, they're light and dark, that the animal's going to produce. And that's what happens. And then he takes the offspring that are speckled and he puts them in front of the sheep and the goats as they're being bred for the same purpose. And then he starts taking the spring herd, animals, goats and sheep, according to what I can read, produce twice a year. The spring animals are the more hardy. And so then he starts doing this with only the spring animals. And over time, he's got a huge flock of multicolored animals that are stronger than Laban's single-colored animals who are weaker. And he just follows this along. Later on, God's going to say, look, I did it. All those solid-colored animals were bred by multicolored animals, just in case you were wondering. So we'll pick up with those thoughts. Yeah, those are good places to stop, aren't they? We'll pick up with those thoughts and finish up and move into the next lesson on Sunday morning. Okay? Thanks, folks.